forgotten anything? No? What are the two major divisions in the Bible? What if I told you that's not right? We're looking a bit stunned. Well, actually, it's not right. Actually, what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament is actually, it should be called the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. That's actually the words that are used. Somewhere along the line it got changed, but the actual Greek word is a translation of a Hebrew word, which is beret, which means covenant. So they should be labelled, and some older, really old Bibles, I think, have Old Covenant and New Covenant. Now, somewhere along the line it got changed. So you've had it wrong all these years. We're not going to try and change it back. That would just be too difficult. But it's actually Old Covenant and New Covenant. So today I want to talk about covenants, because covenants are the key organising principle of the Old Testament. This is the third in our series of trying to make sense of the Old Testament, because many people find the Old Testament really difficult and challenging. So the first week we had a look at some of the background that you need to understand for the Old Testament. We saw that the Bible is God's rescue plan for the world, and this concept of rescue is really an ancient practice called redemption, and that came out of a patriarchal society. So we sort of had to unpack what that meant to understand the big picture of the Bible. And then last week we looked at 8 things that you need to remember. Marion, what are the 3 areas? Yes. Israel, well done. Oh, give her a hand. 3 areas you need to remember. Mesopotamia. I pick on Marion because, well, she's an elder and needs to know these things. Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan. That's the 3, the Fertile Crescent. All the Old Testament happens in those 3 areas. And then I said there are 5 names that you had to remember. What are the 5 names in order? Oh, I can retire. Finally, I've taught you something. All these years. All right. The Bible is about real people and real places, and God's desire to presence himself with us. The Old Testament is a story of our family. And we've used the analogy of a messy cupboard to consider how people view the Old Testament. We have sort of bits of the Old Testament, we have bits of stories here, and this bit here, and this bit here, and it's all jumbled up in our heads, and we need something to organise our cupboard, something to bring order to this mess. So we have the big picture now of God's rescue plan. We have these 5 names and these 3 places. What is the organising principle, and is that of covenants? So I want to talk about covenants today. The 5 people that you've remembered, God makes covenants with these 5 people. He makes an agreement with Adam and Eve in the garden. He makes an agreement with Noah after the flood. He makes an agreement with Abraham concerning his descendants and the land. He makes an agreement with Moses and the people of Israel at Sinai. He makes an agreement with David concerning his dynasty. You literally cannot understand the Old Testament without understanding covenants, which is why we're going to look at covenants today. And the concept of covenant has sort of become quite spiritualized, a bit like the word redemption. And we don't really use covenants very much today in English language. Probably the one place we use it is with land deals. You can have a covenant on a piece of land. So it says the things you're allowed to do if you buy the land. You can't put an old house on it or whatever. But generally we don't use the word covenant very much. Like the word redemption, covenant is not a spiritual word. We tend to think maybe it's a spiritual word, but it's not. It comes from the secular world of ancient culture. A covenant is a bit like a contract. It's an agreement between 2 parties in which one or both would make promises in advance about what they would do. They can be made person to person, they can be made tribe to tribe, they could be made nation to nation. Abram in Genesis makes a binding covenant with his servant around finding a wife for his son. You can read that in Genesis 24. Isaac and Abimelech Abimelech was the king of the Philistines. Philistines, they weren't a nation, they had multiple kings, so really he was just the king of one of the tribes of the Philistines. They make an agreement between each other because they'd sort of been having hassles between the two groups, and so they make an agreement that they won't hassle each other again. In Joshua 9, we read of covenants at a national level. Israel making a covenant with the Gibeonites. And it's this covenants at a national level I want to focus on. How do these things work? And to understand a covenant, we need to understand a term called, and you won't have heard of this term probably before, it's called fictive kinship. Now, you don't need to remember that name, fictive kinship, but you do need to understand the concept behind it. And actually, you do understand the concept behind it, you just don't know it. So let me explain how this sort of works. Remember I said in week 1 that society was entirely organised around households, not nuclear, but extended family. Everything was ordered around a household. That is, your relatives, the oldest male in the family had extra responsibility because he would become the patriarch, and he would get, of this group of people that might be 50, 70, 100 people, and the oldest son gets a double inheritance because he has extra privilege, but also extra responsibility. That's why in the prodigal son parable, the oldest son is so angry because the youngest son has put the whole household at risk. That's why in the story of Joseph, Reuben says he tries to save Joseph from being killed because he has responsibility as the oldest son back to his father. So in ancient society, the closer the blood connection, the greater the responsibility. Now, in this type of society where the key organising principle is this extended family, how do you go about establishing a relationship with someone who is not kin, not family? Well, you would have to make kin out of someone who is not kin. And this is where fictive kinship is from. It's where two parties that are not related agree to act as if they were family. So in a sense, it's a legal sort of fiction. Now, that might seem very abstract, but actually we do this all the time. When two people get married, they're not related. But when they're married, we understand they act as if they're family. When you adopt a child, then when you adopt the child, that you have legal responsibility for that child, even though they're not family. Does that make sense? So both of those are examples of fictive kinship, as it were. So in the ancient world, covenants were a legal mechanism to create a relationship with people who are not blood related. It's a legal mechanism that sets out the privileges and responsibilities to each party. Follow me so far? Yes, this is not very convincing. You mean to say, yes, we did get that, right? Do you get that? All right. You might not, but anyway. All right, so there are two types of treaty, okay? There's what's called a parity treaty, which is between two equal partners, and there's a thing called a suzerain-vassal treaty. Or covenant, sorry. Suzerain is simply a ruler or someone who's more powerful. Vassal is someone who is weaker, okay? Now, a parity treaty was they would use in military. So the ancient world, particularly in Canaan, there was whole lots of all these little groups, and they all had a ruler or a king. So Canaan was full of all these little groups. And remember we learnt about areas, we learnt that Canaan is sort of stuck between the two superpowers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And so they're this buffer zone, and they'd always been being caught in the middle, and being sort of attacked. And so what the rulers or kings would do is they'd form a parity covenant which said, hey, if you get attacked, we'll all come and help you. A bit like NATO, one for all for one. If you get attacked, we'll all come and defend you. And in this kind of treaty, a parity treaty, they would use the word brother to describe the relationship. That is, they're using the language of family. We're not brothers, but we're going to behave as if we were brothers. Fictive kinship. Now, a suzerain vassal treaty was very different, because the suzerain is the more powerful party. They had the right to demand submission from the weaker party. So in this kind of agreement, the two parties would be described as father-son or lord and servant. Just ringing some bells, kind of language that the Bible uses. The suzerain had authority over the people and the land. The vassal could continue to rule his own people, and they could keep their traditions, but the suzerain owned all the land and could expect produce, a percentage of the produce. If a vassal was threatened by another power, the suzerain was expected to come in and defend his vassal. But equally, the vassal was expected to supply their men to help whenever the suzerain was fighting somebody else. If the vassal wanted to rebel, and you read about this all the time, particularly in Kings Chronicles, if he wanted to rebel, then the simplest way of rebelling was not to pay the percentage to the ruler, the suzerain. They would just say, we're not going to pay. Now, a vassal was expected to be totally loyal to a suzerain. The vassal could not make another treaty with another suzerain. To do so would be an act of treason. In a parity agreement, you could have multiple partners, but not in a suzerain-vassal treaty. You could only have one suzerain. Now, the kind of loyalty expected in this kind of treaty is described with the Hebrew word hesed, which is an incredibly common word in the Old Testament. In fact, it's that common that it gets translated in lots of different ways. Loving kindness, faithfulness, covenant loyalty. It's all this word hesed, which means loyal in a covenant agreement. And that kind of agreement comes from blood, like the firstborn to a father. Firstborn son would never commit to another household or another father. That would just be unthinkable. The same with a vassal to a suzerain. It's high treason for a vassal to make another treaty with another suzerain. Now, the story of Gideon is the clearest example of these treaties at work. But they're all through the Old Testament, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence to show that these concepts were very well known throughout the ancient world. So, back to Gideon. So, Joshua set about capturing Canaan, and the Gibeonites realized that they were in trouble. So, they tricked Joshua by pretending to come from a long way away and offer to make a treaty. They literally say, "We are your servants." So what they're asking is that Joshua be their suzerain. And it says they want to cut a treaty. Now, we still say to cut a deal. We'll come back to where this to cut a treaty comes from. I'll come back to that. Now, Joshua doesn't consult God. Never really a good idea. And so they agree to this covenant. The problem was the Gibeonites didn't live a long way away. They lived right next door. And they had a parity covenant with the other kings. Okay? So when the other kings find out that their treaty partner has deserted them, they get together to punish them. So the Gibeonites do what any vassal would do. They say to their suzerain, their ruler, "Hey, you got to come and defend us." And so despite Joshua being tricked, the Israelites have to go and help out the Gideons from these other kings. Now, to make a covenant involved the sacrifice of animals. Literally, this is where the cutting a treaty comes from. The animals would be cut in half, literally, boom, down the middle, and the vassal was expected to walk between them while he recited the oaths. And what this symbolizes, it's a bloody sort of scene. You can imagine these animals cut in half. He's having to walk down the middle, reciting the oaths. And what it's saying in picture language is, if I don't keep these oaths, then I'll end up cut in half. So it's a very powerful picture. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. Afterwards, they wouldn't waste the animals. They would roast them and have a big feast, agreeing to be covenant partners. And that's what we see happening in Genesis chapter 15, verse 9. Abram's really old. He is struggling to believe that God is going to fulfill his promise to give him a son, because he's about 100, and that somehow he's going to inherit the land. He doesn't have any land at all. And so he's struggling. And so he asks God about this. How do I know this is going to happen? This was decades ago that God made this promise. So God tells Abram to go and cut some animals, cut them in half. He puts Abram in a deep sleep. And it says in Genesis 15:18 that God cut a treaty with Abram. Now, there's two fascinating things about this. The first is that God meets Abram where he was at. He meets him in a way that he could understand, using the political covenant sort of language of the day. He could have said, I'm God. What I say goes. But he chooses to meet Abram in his doubt. The second thing is it's God who passes between the animals, not Abram. It's God, the more powerful one. It's meant to be the weaker partner walks through the animals, but it's God who walks through the animals, saying, God is saying basically, I will keep my word. I will not fail. I want you to keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. So these treaties, the blessings were an important part of the treaty. The benefits, if the contract is fulfilled, if the covenant is broken, there are curses. And as I said, in a parity agreement, the partners are now brothers. In a suzerain vassal treaty, the partners are now father, son, or lord and servant. Again, this is in a secular, ancient world. To keep a contract with a suzerain was to love him. To not keep a covenant was to hate him. Does that sound familiar? That's the language of the Bible, coming out of secular, ancient world. Now, the format of covenant was, these were so common that actually they became standardized. There was a sort of standard form. And we have a lot of Hittite, suzerain, vassal treaties from 2nd millennium BC. We've got a lot of examples of them, and they followed exactly the same format. There's a bit of a preamble. The king basically says, I am Lord Pupa, and he lists all his titles. Lots of, da-di-da-di-da. And then there's a historical prologue, which is why the vassal should take part in the treaty. The Hittite treaties, basically the Hittites said, hey, we've been really good to you, and so we think you should do it. The Assyrian treaties, Assyrians were known for their violence. The Assyrians just said, we're more powerful, so that's why you should do it. But there was always a reason given. And then there was the stipulations. The suzerain would say, well, you've got to help me in war, you're going to pay us so much, and you've got to be loyal. And then there was the blessings, which was, we will protect you, and the curses. And the curses in these treaties would often say things like, well, the gods are going to come and get you and send you plagues and stuff like that. But in reality, they didn't really believe in that. And so what it really meant is, actually, if you don't follow the treaty, we're going to come and get you. We'll send our military, and if you're really bad, we'll send you off into exile, or we might even just slaughter you completely. And then there'd be witnesses to the treaty. And again, it's quite funny because they had multiple gods, so they'd list all the gods. And you had to list them all. Sometimes there might be 800 gods, ridiculous number. They had to list all the gods because if you didn't, that would create a legal loophole. So you didn't want any loopholes. So you had to list all the gods of both parties. And then a record would be made. Both parties would, like a contract, both parties would get a record. And the vassal was meant to read the treaty regularly to the people so they all knew. So it was the standard sort of form. Now, what's really interesting is if you look at the treaty at Mount Sinai, it follows this identical model. That is, God used a political form that was well understood to communicate to a people who were incredibly fragmented. Because these people had spent decades in slavery. They were not used to making their own laws. They had no sense of identity of who they were. They'd been abused and beaten. And it says quite clearly that those that came out of Egypt were not just Jews, but a whole mixture of people came out. This concept of having one God was not common. In fact, that was, if you're religious, you'd look after multiple gods. Why would you not honor all the gods? So how could this rebel group of people, abused, beaten, mixed group of people, how could they become a people? Well, God's plan was to choose a vehicle of covenants they could recognize. God offers to be their suzerain, their ruler. Exodus 19, now if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all the people. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So he's using this form. to help the Israelites become a people and help them understand something of what God was like. So we have a look at the treaty at the covenant at Mount Sinai. I am Yahweh. God doesn't go into lots of descriptions of how grand he is and, whatever. He just says, I'm God. It's me. The historical prologue says, what is the reason why you should accept this covenant? And this is so important, what it says here. You could not, one commentator I read said, you could not read 10 pages of the Old Testament without finding, or you'd be struggling to read 10 pages without finding a reference to this concept. I'm Yahweh your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery. That's the reason why. It's a really critical point here. The Israelites were not asked to obey all the stipulations in order to receive God's grace. They were to follow the stipulations because of God's grace, which is exactly the same as the New Testament. Grace comes first. Grace comes first. We're obedient to God. Why? Because of God's grace to us. Anything other than that is legalism. And for whatever reason, we often fall back on legalism and we want to try and be good enough for God or so we can receive his love. No. And then we try and make others fall into that legalism. No. It's grace comes first. And then there's the stipulations. You shall have no other gods but me. You shall not make idols or worship them. God is trying to help them understand in political terms that they understood, just as a nation would never bind themselves to more than one suzerain, so Israel was not to bind itself to more than one deity. And then he sets out the commandments. And then there's the blessings and curses. If you obey, you'll keep the land. If you disobey, you will lose the land. And then he calls on the witnesses. The trouble is there's only one deity. So he's got no one to call on. So he calls on heaven and earth to be witnesses. Now remember when Moses came down the mountain, he had the 2 tablets. And you often see this in kids' Bibles and whatnot. There's 2 tablets. And often you have 5 commandments on one and 5 on the other. That's traditionally. That is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. 10 commandments could easily fit on one tablet with all the other bits as well of the covenant treaty. It's far more likely that 2 copies were the 2 copies of the treaty, of the covenant, one for each of the covenant partners. Each partner was meant to take a copy of the covenant and sit it at home beside their deity, by whom the oath had been sworn. But in this case, there's only one deity, and so both copies are kept in the ark, the box. And just like the Hittite treaties, the weaker party is meant to read out the law regularly to all the people in public reading. So when Moses comes down the mountain, they take an oath. They all agree together they would keep the covenant. There's a ratification ceremony. Bulls were killed. It says that the blood from the bulls was put in basins, half in one basin and half in the other. The first basin went on the altar. In a sense, the first half was given back to God. The second half of the blood, again, this is a very messy sort of ceremony, but the second half of all these bulls that were killed, it says the blood was sprinkled on the people. The blood was sprinkled. The covenant was sealed with blood. This is an amazing moment where this mixed rabble of slaves becomes a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Exodus 19. So let's sum all this up. God uses this well-known political form to introduce himself to this group of people that have been in slavery. God declares who Israel is. He gives them an identity. They had none. They will be his people. They will follow his laws. They'll keep a calendar of holy days. If Israel loves God, he will bless them with peace and prosperity. If Israel hates God, they will be cursed in exile. Israel can rule itself, but they must pay tribute and tithes. They must fight God's wars, obey his laws, and teach the next generation his stipulations. Israel may use the land, but it's not theirs. It belongs to God. If Israel is faithful, they can keep the land. If not, they will lose it. The Old Testament is entirely ordered and structured around these 5 covenants between Adam, Noah, Abram, Moses, and David. Now, when we get our heads around this, suddenly there's a whole lot more richness in what we call the New Covenant. Because we get to the last week of Jesus' ministry. Jesus is this rabbi, he's gathered his disciples round to celebrate the Passover meal, the ritual Passover meal. Every Jew, from oldest to youngest, greatest to least, was required to gather and celebrate the miracle of Exodus. Specifically, they were to remember when the blood was sprinkled on the doorposts so that the 10th plague would pass over their households but strike down the firstborn of Egypt. It was during this Last Supper that Jesus instituted communion. So eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. He broke it into pieces, gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat it, for this is my body." He took the cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant." Now, these words were not some coincidence. The Jews knew the Torah inside the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They knew the Torah inside out. These words, where Jesus says, "For this is my blood, which confirms the covenant," they're echoing the words in Exodus 24, where Moses says, "This is the blood of the covenant." What Jesus is saying is something greater than the Exodus is about to happen. Another rabble of people is about to be transformed into God's covenant people. 1 Peter 2:10, once you had no identity. Remember that, we're a little representation of it here, from multiple backgrounds, multiple nations, multiple cultures, all kinds of people that were gathered here. Once you had no identity as a people. But now we're God's people. Once you'd received no mercy, but now you've received God's mercy. It's in this new covenant that God, the God of the cosmos, is both the suzerain and the sacrifice. Remember, the Old Testaments were sealed, covenants were sealed with a sacrifice. Who's the sacrifice? God himself. Remember when I talked about the covenant with Abraham, where they cut the animals in two, that God himself passed through the torn flesh of the animals, guaranteeing the covenant promises. Remember when the animals were cut in two, it was saying, if I break these promises, my flesh will be torn in two. While Abraham was faithful to the covenant, his descendants were not. But God has been faithful to his side of the covenant. Think about whose flesh was torn to pay the price for the broken covenant. It was Jesus. Jesus' flesh was torn. Jesus is both the representative of humanity and the embodiment of Yahweh, whose flesh was torn, who became the sacrifice, whose blood seals the sacrifice, the suzerain, the more powerful party himself. Can you see the power in this? This is incredibly powerful. The new covenant replaces and surpasses the 5 previous covenants that have been continually broken. This one is sealed with the blood of Jesus. In a minute, we're going to come to communion and celebrate this new covenant that has this rich history that we often fail to understand. But just give opportunity for any questions around this. Chuck some quite tricky concepts in here. Any questions? We had lots last week. I did answer Alan's question about where Jews came from. The name Jews. No questions? Yes, Aaron. No. Aaron asked, so I got told to repeat back the question so people can hear. Is the word hesed, loyalty, used in the fruit of the Spirit? Is it the same word? I don't think so. I'm not an expert on Greek. I'd have to double check, but I'm not sure that's the same word that's used. I'll make a note and check that. I'll have to go back to some commentaries that have Greek and Hebrew in them. Was someone else? Yes, Peter? Yes. Peter said, would they have struggled with the concept of drinking it? Yeah, look, I think that they understood, though, that it was, Jesus was using a metaphor rather than literally drinking. I think the Catholics believe that the wine turns into the literal blood of Christ. Protestants generally don't believe that. So yeah, I think the Jews would have understood that he didn't literally mean going to drink Jesus' blood. Yeah. So I don't think they would have seen that as literal. Yes, James. Yep, James saying the blood of Jesus cleanses our sins. Yep. The blood was simply a way of sealing a covenant, basically saying that I'm putting my life on the line. That this is serious, and so it's sealed with blood represents life, and so this covenant is bound by our lives, as it were. So I don't. Again, it's not a literal that Jesus' blood cleanses sin. It's that the actions of God sealed with this blood have paid the price for sin. Oops. I don't know why this mat keeps going forward. One day I'll fall off. There's full sermon notes at the end. You're welcome to send any questions. I'm going to ask the team to come to the front as we celebrate the new covenant. And think about some of the the symbolism we've learnt today of the covenant, of Jesus as God being the sacrifice, of Jesus actually being the flesh that's been torn, paying the price for the breaking of the covenant. Think of God's grace toward you this morning. I'm trying to get into the habit of praying before each service and is asking God what he wants to do. And last week I shared that I sensed to ask for if you want a prayer for healing. Ros and I prayed for Shirley, and she testified this week her shoulder is much better. I share that not because my prayers are special, but just to encourage you in terms of faith and expectation. And as I was praying this morning, I sensed God say that he wants to free anyone that's living under a sense of condemnation, a sense of shame. Jesus, the New Testament says there's no condemnation for those in Jesus Christ. Why is that? Because God's grace comes first. We don't earn God's love. Just as the Israelites were brought up out of Egypt by God's love, we are brought up out of where we were into a new place. And there's no... So if you'd like prayer for anything at all, then I encourage you, and some of the elders will come up the front here as well. We would love to pray for you. And if you're struggling with a sense of condemnation, we would love to pray for you. That you might understand the freedom that we have and the mercy that's been so freely given by Christ. So team, if you'd like to come up the front, I'll invite you. Some music's going to play in your own time. Come and celebrate the new covenant, sealed with the blood of Jesus. The communion is welcome. Anyone is welcome to come and take communion if you're a Christian, or if you're on a journey heading towards God. You're welcome as well to take that step of faith and say, I might not fully understand this, but I'm going to come and take a step of faith this morning. Then you're also welcome to come and partake in communion. It's open now.